kiddos, today we're going to talk about ecological succession, and basically this is how, you could say in some sense this is how ecosystems heal themselves, or really what it really boils down to is how they change themselves over time. So anytime that there's a change in the types of species for an ecosystem as a whole, not like one species dies out, but like the whole ecosystem undergoes some sort of change, this is what we refer to as ecological succession. And a great example of this is what these two pictures here are. Is this picture on the left in the lower part here is a picture of the area around Mount St. Helens right after it exploded in the 80s. And then this is a picture 25 years later, just a few years ago. And you can see that, you know, there's devastation here. The trees are all blown down. There's basically nothing alive. You can see, I mean, everything is just covered in ash. And then 25 years later, there are plants there, and you start to see even some trees starting to grow up again. And so this is the idea behind succession, that over the course of time, that the species in an area are going to change. So there are two types of succession. The first one is a lot rarer. We don't find this one nearly as much, but primary ecological succession basically means that it's a lifeless area. There's not really any life around, and then its life is going to start there. Okay, not start like created from nothing, but like it's going to start there, and then it's going to, over the course of time, grow into a more mature community. And so the only places that you really see a lot of this, I mean, like some good examples are like if a new volcanic island forms, and of course, you know, if you think back to our soil formation talks that we had earlier, that things have to move in, and mosses and lichens move in and start to break that down to actually form mature soil so that other things can grow. And something like a parking lot, there's no real life there. It's all been paved over, but of course we've all seen parking lots and sidewalks where plants are starting to grow up through them, and that's another example of primary succession. And then in some cases we could even think that when we do remediation on, say, like an old mining site or something, that we're doing some primary succession, because even though there's probably some microorganisms and stuff left there, there's not a whole lot there, and it's basically starting from scratch. What you might want to say is that this is secondary succession, but starting in a different step than a secondary succession often would. So what's a secondary succession? Well, a secondary succession is where there's already soil there, and not all of the life forms are necessarily dead, but there's soil there. There's something there to begin with, but stuff is starting to grow anew, and so it may take a different path than what was originally there. You may not get the same organisms at the end that you had at the beginning. So this is a good example. A great example of when secondary succession happens is during something like a forest fire. Forest fires don't typically burn down everything, but most everything. And so you can sort of see the devastation here. And just over the next couple of slides, I want to show you. So this is a forest fire. I want to say this is in Estonia or Latvia, one of the Baltic countries. And so this is what it initially looked like sort of right after it. And then you can see a year later, some stuff is starting to break through. And then 2 years later, more stuff. And then 3 years later, it's really starting to come back. And you can even see the tops of the trees are starting to come back again. So this is the idea behind secondary succession, that everything wasn't necessarily demolished. You weren't totally starting from scratch, that there was still some life left there. And particularly what really matters is that there was still soil there, that you didn't have to start making the soil. So these essentially are the stages of succession, and you don't have to memorize the stages. You just sort of keep in your mind what's going on at each step. Remember that if you're doing primary succession, you've got a formed soil, that you've got bare rock basically at the beginning, and then you've got so on down the line here. Now, time scale here matters, because for secondary succession, you know, we saw those pictures of the forest. That was a matter of like 3-4 years, and it started to come back relatively well. For primary succession, it's going to take hundreds of thousands of years. And if you think back once again to that soil formation stuff that we talked about, it takes hundreds of thousands of years to form mature soil. So that naturally is going to make primary succession tend to take a little bit longer. So we said the first step could be the bare rock, and then you're going to get your pioneer organisms in step 2 here. Okay, pioneer organisms are just the initial things, the first things that sort of come back. A lot of times in primary succession, it's going to be things like mosses and lichens, because those are the things that are going to sort of latch on. They can draw their nutrients directly out of the minerals in the rock, and so they're going to then start to leach out their acid and start to break down the rock, and that's how soil is going to start to form. Or it could be mosses, or maybe even some sort of wheat grasses. In secondary succession, the first things that sort of spring through the soil. Remember, there's soil there already for secondary, whereas in primary, it's pretty much bare rock when you're starting out. And then you're going to move on to like maybe some flowering plants, maybe some hardier grasses or thicker grasses, and wildflowers and stuff like that are going to start to grow up. And then you're going to get shrubs, what we call woody pioneers. So things like this, where you're starting to get some things that are starting to grow a little bit away from the ground. They're getting a little bit bigger, and that's because they've got more soil. If you look, it's hard to see the graph down here at the bottom. We'll talk about it in a second, but you see the soil layer is starting to build up now, so that bigger things can put down root systems and be able to grow bigger. And so you get things like shrubs or maybe some really small trees. And then in the fifth stage here, we'll get what are called fast-growing trees. And this is a really good example of this. These are called lodgepole pines. And in a lot of areas, farmers actually get subsidies to, instead of maybe grow crops or something, to plant trees, because the idea is, we're making a big carbon sink there. We're pulling carbon in, sequestering it out of the atmosphere. And so these kinds of forests tend to become, sometimes they're called trash forests, because they grow really quickly, but there's not really much diversity in them. I mean, if you've ever seen a pine forest, there's not a whole lot around other than the pine, if that's the main anchoring tree. And I know when I grew up in Florida, they were having a lot of freezes, and so the orange groves left. I know, Florida. So they had a lot of freezes, and so in the area I live, the orange growers quit growing oranges, and instead in a lot of places they would plant these pine forests, because they were going to be able to timber cut them in 10, 15, 20 years. And secondly, they were getting subsidies for that. And so you'd see like these neat, even rows of pine trees planted that were obviously not terribly natural. So that's the fifth step there. That's like the penultimate step. The next to last step is where you're starting to get some trees, the ones that grow really quickly. And then finally, you get to what we call a climax community, where you have basically your long-term trees, okay, your oaks and your maples, if we're talking about deciduous forest like in our area, that are really sort of the anchors for the whole ecosystem. I mean, these are some of the keystone species and some of the foundational species, because they're going to provide a habitat for other kinds of animals. And in the climax community, where you're sort of reaching the end point, of course, it's not like there's not change. There is a lot of change. But to some degree, maybe in some sort of equilibrium type situation, where some things die off, new things come, but then there's a community there that's pretty stable for a long period of time. And so that's sort of the ending stage. Now, does it die off after that? No. I mean, it's going to go on for thousands and thousands of years. And of course, the individuals in that ecosystem might die off, but the populations and communities as a whole continue to move on. Now, I want to look real quickly down here at the bottom at this graph. Let me zoom this down here a little bit. If you look at this graph, what's going on here is the soil layer is increasing, and as the soil level increases, what's really important to us is that the biodiversity increases. And that's what's kind of important, because remember, we talked about the fact that very often systems are more stable if they have an increased biodiversity. If your food web is bigger, and then you can survive a couple of things moving out of the food web. One thing being pulled out doesn't necessarily cause the whole thing to collapse down. And so as the biodiversity increases here, as you get towards the climax community, then you're going to have a much more stable environment, of course, and that's something that we want. We want stable, sustainable environments. And so we try to encourage those climax communities, and we try to discourage the destruction of climax communities, even if someone might have a plan that says, hey, well, we could regrow this, and like you say, in mining. And we can sometimes, but it's going to take a long time to get back to that stable community. Speaking of stability, I want to just real briefly mention a couple of quick points about stability. Two kinds of stability that we're talking about here with ecosystems. One of them is persistence, and persistence means that it can withstand disturbances pretty well. And like a tropical rainforest is an awesome example of this, because like tiny disturbances, or maybe like a little bit of fire or a few species dying out or something like that, is not going to bring the whole rainforest down. And the reason for that is there's a massive amount of species richness there, right? There's a lot of different species, and so pulling a few of them out isn't going to cause the whole thing to collapse. And then there's this type of stability that is resilience, and resilience basically says that how quickly can the ecosystem be restored after it's basically been destroyed or wiped out by some sort of disturbance? Can it come back pretty quickly? And so like a grassland, or really even like some of those, a pine forest or something, is able to recover relatively quickly. And the reason behind that, if you think about it, if you think back to the idea of species richness, a grassland or some of those forests, like a pine forest, a boreal forest, are not very species rich, and so therefore it doesn't take as long to grow back those species, because you don't have a massive intricate web of species. You've got a much smaller web. Whereas in a place like a rainforest or a coral reef or something like that, where you do have a massive amount of species richness, they can resist change pretty well. That's the persistence part. they can withstand the change, but they're not going to grow back very quickly afterwards. And that's one of the problems that we find in rainforests, that they can sustain a lot of damage, but if you actually start to say cut it down and then you wanted to say replant it, like maybe you're in the Amazon and you said, hey, this area got clear cut, but we want to regrow it, it's not really going to come back in the same way. Those ecosystems are not able to recover in that way, and they never really return to that original state of richness, at least not in any human lifetime span. Thanks, guys.